Okay, welcome. Okay, preparation time is up. Hopefully I'm audible. Welcome everyone to the grand finals of the Kansai 2021. Congratulations to both teams for making it thus far in the competition. On side government, we have the Kansai. On side opposition, we have Osan A. I'm joined on the panel by four illustrious judges who are Aika-san, Mizo-san, Tamura-san, and Sota. I would appreciate it if both teams could refer to the panel as a whole. Finally, I invite speakers and judges to disclose any preferred gender pronouns if you'd like to, as is stated in the equity briefings. Otherwise, we would appreciate it if you could use gender-neutral language when referring to each other. So that's all. Without any further ado, I would like to call upon Prime Minister to open this grand final. Hear, hear.
Here. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Chair. There's no absolute justice in the society. That is context depending. In these circumstances, flexibly reflecting the idea of people having progressive change in the society is extremely important. In this sense, like common law system is better than lay civil law system. Therefore, we are very happy to propose these motions. Today, we have three arguments. Firstly, let me give you a metric to decide winner of this debate. Secondly, problem of civil law system. Lastly, benefit of our side. The setup is written in the info slide. Then, first of all, let's talk about a metric. Because this debate is a debate about ask what is a true justice. That's why this point is very important to determine the impact of this debate. As I already told you in the introduction, we say absolute justice will not exist because justice is very subjective and different from context to context. In these circumstances, reflection of actual will of people on a society is extremely important things to determine what is justice in that context. That's why that reflection of will be a significant part in this debate. Given this part, secondly, let me approve problem of civil law system. We say opposition might argue that they can change law itself flexibly. That's why there's no problem. We say I'm going to argue the structural reasons why it's very difficult to change the law itself. I have three reasons here. Firstly, because privileged individuals are likely to support a conservative idea and law and hamper changing the process to change a law. Because privileged individuals already get benefit from pre-existing conservative structure, and they want to continue to keep getting benefit from it. Now, for example, a liberal party in the country is already strong, and they are supported by the conservative and many elderly individuals. Just like Koizumi and Abe, they have the political dynasty which try to entrench the norm of conservative idea. In these circumstances, they want to get the benefit from the conservative individual and traditional way of living. In these circumstances, in order to like answer demand from a noisy minority that is the elderly and those very conservative, politically very active individual. They want to continue to have a law which bind people's rights, for example, like a gay marriage law or like the outing is not like or not fundamental assault on a human dignity. In these circumstances, secondly, those strong political individuals have human connections between the bureaucrat or those kind of individual people. In these circumstances, those people can be the very obstacle to change law framework. In these circumstances, even if apart from actual like voting rate, society is changing in a very progressive way, and the people in generally in mind gay marriage is okay, outing is very bad, but because of this very silent, noisy minorities' voices will be heard by pre-existing structural individual, and those people's voices will be very prioritized. In these circumstances, it is extremely difficult to change law framework itself. The third reason is even we consider the best case scenario maybe provided from opposition in some way, like they can make it to change the law. But even in these cases, it is already harmful because the process to change law is extremely time consuming. Because in order to change the law, maybe lawmaker have to suggest, and then the parliament they have to be discussed, and then finally, after the very several years, such kind of things will be implemented. We cannot wait for that, right? Because those kind of things are very less might be like less prioritized more. For example, when the coronavirus happening occur, like the political discourse will be focusing on such kind of things much more. In these circumstances, the politician can make excuse. Oh, currently we don't have time to discuss about such kind of some few gay marriage things or that kind of things. We have to focus much on the economic things or that kind of coronavirus things. In these circumstances, those kind of delay will be extremely large in the very future. In these circumstances, what is impact of this? With the impact is very clear. With a progressive judgment to try to protect people's right cannot be done. For example, things like gay marriage are not to be allowed in the Japan in the many area, and like outing is not outrageous action to deny fundamental human rights now recognized because those people who actually did outing was not so clearly prosecuted and criminalized. In these circumstances, just like this, entrenching traditional idea and entrenching that law framework is very significantly harming the very minority individual and not reflecting actual voices the majority of individual. Just like a Japan, even though young people and the middle-aged people just generally think that the gay marriage can be very okay, but such noisy minorities' voices will be prioritized. That is a significant harm.
Point.
Okay.
Taken. If the vast majority of people opposes gay marriage under a democratic system, why should a judge have the power to overturn the voices of the majority?
I cannot say that perfectly. Every progressive opinion will be hard, but comparatively, like judges can be interpreted in a better way to protect a people on our side. I will explain this from now, and maybe Kanchan will very sufficiently extend this part. With the benefit of common law system, as I said, with the interpretation of a judge can be very subjective, which I might argue. We say this is very beneficial because this have more possibility to have more flexible decision by reflecting the will of citizens, just like the United States. Let's be very clear about characteristics of judges. Oppo will say maybe judges also contaminated by some biases, but it's comparatively better than the structural reasons why, as I already told you in the harm point. Because judges are just the individual and subjective, and their age is different, and the race is different, and life experience is different. In these circumstances, if you are judges as a African American, you can be brave enough to judge for the very out of a biases, you can do that. And also, if you are a white individual who can sympathize with the harm of the gayness, you can be very brave enough to think of a right of the gay, and you can argue that this interpretation of law is extremely bad. Therefore, I have to be independent from such kind of law framework and have to protect right of individual. Therefore, in a country where like common law system is introduced in the United States, more like progressive change is existing currently. By doing so, we can reflect will of citizens and we can have a progressive change in the society. In these circumstances, we can actually give the important definition of justice for the individual. When people actually recognize that gay marriage is okay and like outing is extremely bad, in these circumstances, on our side, we have a probability that we can allow such kind of justice to happen to protect those individuals. For these reasons, for the flexible definition of justice, like common law system is better. That's why we are very happy to propose this motion. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Next, I'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Ah, はい、聞こえますでしょうか。
はい、聞こえます。
Thank you, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. So the government side proposed a metric of social changes being very important. We didn't really see a justification of why that is true. The more important and more realistic way to judge this debate is which side best serves the most important principles of criminal justice systems. Because we both agree on our side, on both sides of this bench, that criminal justice systems should be implemented and is important, does serve an important role in society, and therefore we think that we need to look at whether the system itself is just. And we think that civil law system, where there is guaranteed accessibility, more clarity in the process, is much more better, because in the end we are talking about laws limiting rights of people, and we think the clarity is important. So three things from in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to give a holistic rebuttal to what we heard from the previous speaker in terms of social changes. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the principles of installing criminal justice system in the first place, and why common law is less just compared to civil laws. Lastly, I'm going to talk about why we think that the real-life implementation of the common law system leads to exclusive harms to the vulnerable groups in so many ways. So firstly, let's look at a rebuttal to the previous speaker. So they have told us that rich people are very bad. Rich are like strong people, the conservative people, privileged people. They are what's in the block of social changes. We agree. The thing is, ladies and gentlemen, the exclusive difference between government side and the opposition side is whether it is the judges themselves, the judges who are from privileged background themselves are in direct control of creating the laws, or is it through the parliament? So that's the difference. On the government side, it's judges directly making the law, and we think this is going to be bad. So let's compare the judges and the publics. So the judges are very, very likely to come from privileged backgrounds, because it's expensive to become a lawyer in the first to become a legal expert in the first place. And it is about the family culture of being involved in the legal industry or whatever. Public, on the other hand, who are the participants and the lawmakers in the most ultimate sense, are consisting of both the strong people and the weak people, and they discuss things. So there's less of an echo chamber effect here, meaning that people may hear voices, even the people who are in the stronger side of society and people in the intermediate, they hear stories of the weak public, and they can emphasize with that, and then that leads to changes in laws. We think that this is very important to acknowledge, and that's why we think that even in nations where we do have civil laws implemented, things are actually changing. Another thing we heard from the previous speaker was the speed of change. Now we think that in order to change things, it's often in common law system. It's a new judges from new backgrounds who are very weak in the past coming up. So it's about Black judges and Hispanic judges and Asian judges in America newly introducing changes. For these new judges to come up, you need to study like for 40 years in order to get power and a say in the legal structure in the first place. In terms of elections, if the mass makes a voice out of it, it changes the elections, it changes the motivation of the politicians for the next election, which comes in 4 years. So speed of changes comes on our side of the house. Let's look at the principle of the legal system. The first thing we need to acknowledge is that the accessibility to law is very, very important in the first place. Firstly, we say that in the status quo, people can be prosecuted, note it down, for breaking a law you didn't even know about. That's why foreigners may come to another country and then get prosecuted for a law they didn't think existed. The justification for this happening is that it is documented, it's clear, you can have the capacity to know if you wanted to. But the thing is, when it comes to common law system, it's really up to the judges to decide how what the individual writing and documented sentences of the laws actually mean, which cases it's going to apply to, and how much punishment is going to be inflicted upon you when you infringe that. That's why we think that we can say that this is important. But secondly, we say in terms of your capacity, it's also important, because already in terms of moral culpability, we already don't punish people who didn't really have the capacity to understand law and to control yourself. the capacity to avoid breaking law is important, and that's why we don't prosecute mentally ill people. The problem with the common law system is that you can't have the capacity to avoid law because it is unclear. It's up to the judges who may well have racist wills, and that is ultimately very important to acknowledge. I'll take you later. The second thing I would mention is that consent to the process making of the lawmaking process is very important because laws are there to limit your rights. It's about balancing your rights. Your right to free speech is hampered by the law that says safe speeches are bad in order to make sure that the other people's rights are fulfilled. But the thing is, the only way for anybody else to justify making your rights a little bit smaller is that you participated in the process of making that law, ladies and gentlemen. We think this is important because people should fundamentally be free, and offense by the state should be limited to the minimum extent. Because everybody is born into a system without consent, it means that you have to be able to participate in that, and you have to advance your own causes, and you aren't allowed to do that on a common law system because it's all about the privileged elite making that law. I'll take you.
Given the cost in many countries, there is a political apathy of people, and there is a domination of power by the allegedly rich individual. In these circumstances, how such dynamic political discourse reflect the actual voices of citizens can be done on your paradigm?
Literally in America, people are going on the streets and burning things in order to express their views, in order to show that they're not apathetic towards politics. But lastly, let's move on to why we think it's bad for the vulnerable groups. First thing, in terms of accessibility to laws, we think that it is also often very unclear about whether that law applies to this case in common law. So what that means is that it's really up to the judges. So it means that you might be sued or you might be prosecuted for something you never thought to be illegal in the first place. It's about how you interpret. It's how about the judges interpret. Often the interpretation by judges in common law is done by looking at precedents, and this is another problem because it is now becomes more unfair for the historically weak beings, like in America, the black population, because America has created a legal system and puts a lot of black people into jail historically, even right after the releasing of the slaves, because they wanted to utilize them as labor forces. We think that leads to a precedent where black people has been exclusively sentenced with bad or even longer prison sentences for no reasons, just because a white judge felt that it is important to prosecute this person, and this is unjust. We oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition for that speech. Next, I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
はい、聞こえますか？
はい、聞こえます。
はーい。よいしょ。Two things to talk about. Firstly, regarding engagement coming from the opposition side, and secondly, how common law distinguish each cases of trial and apply to specific cases based on established precedents and why this is good. Let me explain one by one. The battles will be integrated. Firstly, regarding the engagement. They talked about, firstly, those judges themselves control law under the common law system, and that is biased because of the biased background of the judges. They said they are privileged, judges are privileged. On the other hand, parliament is representation of society, including privileged and vulnerable. Incorrect. This is simply not mutually exclusive at all. Those people is generally privileged person coming from the privileged status. Difference here is those cases are influenced by the citizen directly under our paradigm because of the social trend and picking method to choose the established precedent. Under their paradigm, the person who creates that strict law system is privileged, and that is already fixed and cannot be changeable and challengeable even. We think that is bad under their paradigm. But secondly, they talked about as impact, accessibility, and capacity is better at the civil law system because they cannot ignore law, because it is written, because it is accountable. Firstly, also not mutually exclusive at all. Even under our paradigm, in each cases of trial, they have to write document and clarify what is the reason why they have to apply the law into this precedent and established precedent to begin with. In these circumstances, we think rather this is more clearer and clarity exists here to begin with, because under their paradigm, they have to read the very, very outdated law document to begin with. That social background is largely different, people's moral is largely different, and the people who make it is already passed away, ladies and gentlemen. Under our paradigm, people are writing and updating law is living, and that is hard from the other judges to begin with. We think at the accessibility and at the capacity, we are better on the side of the house. And also, they talked about the newcomer judge needed to study. Oh, please study as much as possible. That is the obligation to reflect the social voice and learn the past precedent as much as possible. We think that is completely fine under our paradigm. So, moving on the case coming from our side of the house. Firstly, let's examine what is exclusive point on our side of the house. The exclusive point here is whether judges have room to interpret law and the range of application of the law. That will be matter, for example, when considering what to extent mental insanity can be the mitigatory factor, or for example, which past precedents judge will pick up and follow to begin with. Secondly, why this is better framework to make decisions which is likely to be accepted and supported by the society from 3 reasons why. Firstly, each judge will tend to listen to the social opinion and the voice of jury under our paradigm, because otherwise they are crucially criticized as lazy actor who doesn't fulfill their obligation. Therefore, the incentive of the judges is more likely to be side of the society and try to listen to the not only the majority but also minority, because minority also has a certain number, and to neglect and excessive amount of punishment will be backlashed anyway in the case of the Black Lives Matter or like that thing. Secondly, social discourse will be provoked more, and it leads to next direction of the court decision to begin with, because the people can require and reflect their voice under our paradigm and update the guideline of the trial. And here is the preemption. It doesn't mean rampant change of law and how to apply law, because the judge is one who interprets the social opinion and transcends that into the law framework to begin with. In these circumstances, always the person who chooses those established precedents is the judges, who is a professional actor, learn the structure of the law and the experience, the accumulation of the law, and listen to the current norm and current moral justice, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's better under our paradigm. But thirdly, trustworthy and on the court is improved exclusively under our paradigm, because when the minority or the vulnerable existence is getting disadvantaged by those law framework and application of the law, they can voice out, and that is hard from the court trial to begin with. In these circumstances, they have the future motivation to challenge the law forever. Under their paradigm, there is no possibility, precisely because they cannot change the law framework and cannot change the way to choose the precedent example to begin with. Okay.
Taken.
Could you clarify the exact process on how judges are chosen, and what kind of exclusive difference are there between politicians?
That is the final part of the example and the illustration coming from our side of the house. Why this is important and legitimate metric to access the debate? Because ultimately, law and order exist for better consent, better approval, and better following order and law. How this looks like. For example, after Black Lives Matter movement require more consideration of the unfairness between races, judges of court, when facing Black people trial, will change the use of established precedent and publicly announced like that the past punishment on the black was too severe, precisely because the at that timing, judges are dominated by the white people or the conservative people or the racist or like that thing. It doesn't fit the current norm and moral justice. So I change the example of the established precedent and choose lighter established precedent. We think that is exclusively moving forward a driving force for the better protection of the minority and better representation of the law framework. We think that's clearly better under our paradigm. But of course, sometimes that has error. That is not exclusive in both paradigm. Then point here is in which paradigm it's easier to change that error and mistakes to begin with. We think that is clearly better and faster under our paradigm, as Prime Minister suggested. In these circumstances, exclusively under our paradigm, we can be flexible, and when mistakes happen, that is where the change is coming. In these circumstances, we think that's a clearly better outcome, and we think that is updated nowadays, day by day. We think that's clearly better. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Next, I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. First on engagement and then to reconstruction. So basically, proposition gave us two argumentations. Firstly, they talked about how democratic change of law is unlikely to happen because privileged people are conservative and they control politics. 3 responses here. We told you that A, it's factual that laws are not changing in the status quo. When we look at Japan, we see that over 100 laws are created every single year. We think that criminal laws are something that is publicly debated all the time. For example, we oftentimes hear news about the validity of juvenile laws existing or the legal age, for example, right? We also have discourses about mental health and legal accountability. In the US, for example, we think that because our representatives are making the changes, it is subjected to a greater check and balance system of the citizens and therefore likely to have more discourse and more change in our side of the house. Secondly, we tell you that even if there is little change and the conservative laws are continuously chosen by the people, which we don't really think is going to be the case, as I will explain in my constructive, I do not know why government paradigm is better, right? The vast majority of people, if they prefer laws that are conservative because they value things like traditional family values or whatnot, we think we would better have a legal framework that is accommodating to the desires of the people. I don't know why, specifically because this specific judge has a liberal ideology, then reflecting that ideology and making it a law and then forcing it in every single citizen is something that is principally justified, right? He didn't really explain why that was the case. But notice that because they're able to do that, they also have to bite the bullet about having conservative ideologies being reflected in the same way. He talked about how gay marriage being promoted even though society is relatively conservative, but the opposite can just as well as happen, right? A progressive society might want an increase of accessibility to marital rights, but a judge might be conservative and not allow that to happen in terms of interpretation of marital laws. They need to bite the bullet on that, but our principle stands independent of the outcome, specifically because in either case it is unjust for the judge to be the representative of determining what kind of legal system we are going to live in. The last engagement on this point is that in comparison to becoming a judge of the Supreme Court, we think that it is more accessible for minorities and underprivileged people to access politics. Literally, you only have to fill in a ballot. Even if we acknowledge the fact that there is little discourse on legal frameworks or criminal justice system, even if that is the case, if you as a minority community being affected by these things, you can probably still look up the legal manifestos of specific political parties and manifest your opinions through the process of voting. We think this is much more accessible than having to go to law school, having to pay for it, and overcome all of the glass ceilings that pre-exist because of racism and whatnot, and changing the interpretation of the law. The second thing they talked about was that judges fear backlash, so they will listen to the opinions of the people. Recognize that this completely contradicts their argument about having a liberal judge in a conservative context. But secondly, we tell you that there is no elections for judges in comparison to politicians who are more likely to cater to what the people have to say. Lastly, we tell you that people are unable to understand legal jargons given by judges or looking at the results of the court system, whereas in elections, politicians and the media in our side of the house have an active incentive to break down legal manifesto because they need people to understand in order for them to support them, right? Therefore, we think in all cases, the argumentations mechanistically don't make sense, and we take the debate. Moving on to the reconstruction, but yes, sure.
Taken.
When policy is taken and influence the court, when it comes to juvenile law change, that takes 30 years. Why this is actually money out to voice of citizen?
Because I have no idea why they assume that it takes 30 years to pass a law. Literally 100 laws are being passed every year. We think that's just an assumption and an assertion that's not really being justified. We think the system of governance, system of the parliament exists to pass laws, and it is functioning perfectly fine. But moving on to the characteristics of judges and why it is likely to be problematic. We think in the vast majority of cases, rich privileged people who are the ethnic majority who are given the power to subjectively control the interpretation of the law on government's side. This is important because government's whole case was not affirming a legal system, but was claiming that liberal values are good. Even if we buy their unsubstantiated premise, we still take this debate because this enfranchisement unfortunately happens on both sides, even in a democratic process or a legal system to some extent, but the injustices are exacerbated when privileged people can decide how many years a minority group is going to be incarcerated and whatnot, right? We tell you that precedents having power means that societal progression in things like rights of minorities are less likely to be manifested in the court system. Why is this the case? We think that the interpretation of anti-drug laws had been extremely racist against Black communities. This was largely because in the past, prejudices and blatant racism led to giving the fullest sentences and mass incarceration. There's two impacts that happens and is worsened under a common law system. Firstly, we say that judges are unlikely to have these prejudices because in order for you to become a judge, you're probably quite old, you probably don't have access to the changing social narratives, etc. We only see like old guys on the court system, let's be fair. So unfair interpretation towards marginalized communities is likely to continue. But secondly, even if the judge is extremely progressive, unless you are in the highest court, i.e. the Supreme Court, which is extremely inaccessible, you can make very little change because recognize that the common law means that you have to obey precedent when there already is a precedent. The precedent is determined primarily by the Supreme Court. We think this is something that is extremely inaccessible. The comparison that even in the best case scenario in Gov, well, let's say 90% of people are liberal, if 10% of the judges are conservative and are making racist laws, we tell you that the precedent of that can lead to decades of impacts and mass incarceration we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. Next, I'd like to call upon the Government Whip. Hear.
あ、聞こえますか？
はい、聞こえます。
あ、じゃあやります。Well, three things to talk about. So firstly, let's analyze the characteristic of
Debate start.
It's relatively achieved on the other side of the house. Firstly, let's talk about the characteristic of judges. So opposition characteristic is like they're likely to privilege, so they are likely undermine the minority voices, etc. To respond to here. So firstly, even it's true, but it is relatively better than the politician, right? First of all, is a politician likely to prioritize only political voices they can care about, right? And these political voices they can focusing on they can hear from minority is very limited in the first place. And also they are likely to prioritize political voice, for example, vote, like over the public discourse, etc. And also this kind of vote political tools are very limited in case of the minority people, for example, like gerrymandering or kind of lack of knowledge, lack of time, etc. And secondly, the DLO response is that but DLO says that, or it's okay to vote, but we tell you the political tools can be limited and not available in some instances for the minority. On that occasion, I don't think it is sufficient. Secondly, but comparatively, judges are not so contingent upon this kind of limited capacity from like only privileged people can access. So every people can access, for example, the social discourse which can determine pressure or which potentially can lead to the progressive interpretation, etc. In terms of accessibility, so our side is far more better. Secondly, even if the so judges are very privileged, and firstly, I don't think that there is no necessity, for example, very 100% diverse judges, right? Even if the black people, for example, if they are shared identity as a minority, maybe they are likely to care about the other minority people, for example, sexual minority, other ethnic minority. So even though another types of minority don't exist, but still it is sufficient extent can be guarded on the other side. Lastly, even they're privileged, but they are far more likely to sympathize minority rather than politician, right? Because they can more easy access to know how harsh the minority reality is, because they actually literally deal with many cases which infringing the right of the minority. For example, some black people are easily arrested, some people are evicted, or etc. Immigrants can be harmed, arrested, etc. etc. On that occasion, their daily life level, they can deal with these kind of cases. They know the reality, what kind of harm it actually inflict upon the minority under the law system. On that occasion, compared to politicians which don't know about in detail this kind of reality, so even if we think that assuming both sides are coming from privilege and they know the actual reality, but that comparatively through the job, judges can know that and can more sympathize because of accessibility. So although given that our side is far more better, even given the privilegedness. Secondly, the second thing coming from this based on this characterization coming from opposition is that it's unfair because, for example, if the white people feel that it is necessary, like maybe they are going to justify the punishment on black people. Even if it happened, please be comparative, right? This is a comparative between the evil individual and evil institution which they have to support, right? Firstly, even if some individuals are a little bit evil on the our side, but still there is room for change, right? For example, second appeal, final appeal, or if it's worst case scenario, very radical specific judges continuously do the discriminative verdict, maybe the criticism or pressurization happen due to given political correctness, etc. On that occasion, we avoid the worst case scenario compared to their side. But secondly, under opposition side, even no matter how good judges exist on their side, even if good judge majority under opposition side, but still, this institution as a whole defines how judge should behave, how judge should give the verdict to the criminal. So that's why they can't change the behavior on their view, right? So relatively, our side is far more better entirely. Secondly, let's talk about the liberty to DLO. First, firstly, defeated opposition by other liberty to our side by they saying that if it is judges temporarily better, but if the judges change, the interpretation change. We think it's fine, it's not harm, because please look at the reason why judges were changed, right? Maybe the reason why they are appointed within the Supreme Court, for example, maybe they are recognized as their value is compatible with the social norm, or they are more likely to accept it within the general public, etc. On that occasion, they are exactly representing what the exactly current demand, current value, how it looks like, right? And secondly, for example, the DLO as an example, anti-drug is unfair, was unfair, etc. I don't know it is the intention to work to prove, but even if it is like effective example, but if it is known as unfair, maybe unlikely to prolong, right? Because they are already many people regard as unfair, proven should be correct. And lastly, they say that like other and on our side, that one decision can be affected for future decision. Firstly, maybe that like one decision, previous decision, can be affected in some cases in the future, but I think that like judges can choose which pre-existing cases is going to apply in the current situation, right? And secondly, in the best case scenario, we can create other cases, other new progressive interpretation. On that occasion, I don't think that this existence of the foreign pre-existing cases entirely abiding the consequences. And so the
Taken.
Judges are not getting the license to judge because they watch the BBC every day. They're being licensed, they're being and allowed to judge because they learned many precedences.
I don't know what you mean, but still I don't think it destroy the data we tell you, or the judges can be better than politicians. Firstly, let's talk about the worst case scenario. Firstly, we tell you it is form a quicker change our side of the house. Even if we assuming both sides scenario has a bad propensity, but it can be changed easier. Dealing with propensity is our side. Especially from the zero is that every time 100 law changes, etc. First of all, it is only cases to trivial law which easier to change. For example, I don't know, the cap about the 12-year random financial obligation, for example, it's not including what is going to be criminalized, etc. Because it's too impactful. It really the vested interest to fear the reaction coming from the public. Let's talk about the principle lastly. Finally, under opposition side, it is impossible to perfectly consent everything law with about individual. Right? On that occasion, we think our side is better because the law is the response to the individual action. This individual making action coming from the internalization social value, which determine what is the evil, what is the justice. On that occasion, under our side, far better to respond to the individual value which they are internalized within the society, because our side far more like society progressive transition. For example, what is the bad, what is the outing is better or bad, gay marriage better or good or not, or this kind of value can be more accepted within the right. They have to support the older older version of never updated law, which is not representing the current generation adults purpose.
I thank the government whip for that speech. Next, I'd like to call upon the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Okay, thanks.
Yes.
My speech starts 3, 2, 1. Sorry, wait. I clicked somewhere on the advertisement on app to record my speech. Sorry. Okay. My speech starts 3, 2, 1. To simplify today's government bench, the Kansai, they support a dictatorial country which have only one law saying bad doings are punished. Then justice will freely interpret whatever they want to do. Then random individuals are arrested based on the arbitrary interpretation of some individual justice. We think this situation is horrific. From leader of opposition, we clearly told you that individual rights should be constrained only based on consensual decisions and based on clear boundary, where states have stated that on this criteria your right is constrained. We think this prerequisite about the principle of law was never touched upon the affirmative side. We think this is the only reason, the simple reason we are already winning in this debate. To further debate, I'm going to tell you 2 issues. First, about the principle of law. Second, 3 issues. Second, I'm going to compare provides examining three structural differences and between judges and politicians. And I will going to tell you why, even under the metric about the speed of change, politicians are better actors than judges. Lastly, I'm going to tell you compare about citizen reaction and interest towards the political issues, and the point about apathy, which affirmative side asserted, on balance, can be better achieved on the outside, which is a prerequisite for their goal to be achieved, which is to reflect voices of citizens. All rebuttals are incorporated in those three issues. First, principle of the law. From first speech, we clearly told you that individuals are blameworthy only when they could have avoided illegal act, but they have failed to do so. Insanity defense exists because people under insanity are sometimes out of control in order to have sufficient agency to avoid illegal acts, such as traffic accidents, such as some jaywalking or whatever. Threats, like crimes committed under threat, are not punished because those suspected individuals are under threat of their lives, then they have no agency to avoid illegal act. Those basic principle of CGS is breached structurally under the existence of the common law, because under common law, what is crime, what deserves to breach law is up to individual judges. We think it is quite detrimental because it's just random factor determines whether my right can be constrained or not. We think this is detrimental, and their argument about speed of change cannot be the overriding factor against this principle, as I explained in my introduction. They are not supporting the world, those kind of horrific words. Even like the speed of change is not important because those individuals could not have avoided those illegal acts unless those laws are clearly stated. We think our principle is overridingly important.
Taken.
Why consent is impossible to take under our paradigm, and you are ignoring consent of citizen to interpret law 100%, at least under our paradigm 60 or the amount number of consent is taken because of the hearing voice of citizen.
To emphasize, I honestly think government bench failed to provide even one logical reasonings to prove why judges are able or have incentive to listen to the citizens' voices. They just said they care criticisms without telling any reasons I'm going to scrutinize later. But still, it's pragmatic, contingent upon pragmatics about the character of the judges, which is up to individual characteristics. We told you structural reasonings about common law systems where individual judges can freely decide, which is a structural problems because individual fate and the constraint of the right is decided by individual random discretion. We think this is horrific and those systems should not be taken. Secondly, comparing three metrics about judges and politicians. First, about the process to become. We already told you that the judges needed to study 30, 40 years to become judges. Kanta said it's fine, it's not fine, because those minorities have to take extremely longer years to climb up social ladder. While politicians are carrying number of votes in terms of demographics, then those minorities just joining next election, which comes in the 4 years, can change the society. Obviously, those comparative provided in the LO, which was completely neglected until DPA and the government. I think Shinya's reply is too late. Next comparative is about expertise they got through the career processes. We told you judges learn accumulated precedent, which is a negative legacy of the human societies upon the discrimination, which is something that the government side have conceded. The interesting argument coming from government bench is that, oh, because they learned precedent, they empathize because they understand the suffering of the minorities. Then, presumably, the nuance here was that those judges are going to give opposite verdicts than precedents, against precedents. This is not how common law system works. InfoSlide says judges will interpret law and apply to specific cases based on precedents, which means they are majorly following precedents. Yeah, then they are following negative legacies, which means those judges are biased. Then, while that, politicians are applying based on the deductive theories, which was continuously being updated both domestically and internationally, and those latest idea of how law should be, and how individual rights should be determined, or what is the theft, for example, in terms of theft, for example, like the invisible properties such as like electricities, or those invisible properties are not deemed to be theft for years, but because those theories are updated continuously, we are able to apply those issues. Those things are not achieved under the Assembly House. Structure to determine interest of judges about politicians last comparative. Judges care criticism, they haven't told any reasons. Presumably, judges are promoted based on peer evaluations and selections among judges. Then they are promoted from regional courts to upper courts. We told you from LO that it is full of echo chamber. Those people are not going to reflect the voices of citizens. While the politicians are directly influenced by the vote and small portion of demographics, just by getting a small portion of demographics can win the electoral district, which means those politicians have the incentive to listen to the voices. They might say from government reply that judges are elected. That's why I'm going to care lastly about the political apathy. Citizens have less interest to court than legislators because court matters only when you are arrested. But legislature matters. Those laws are made and which affect every single aspect of your life. For example, welfare, for example, economic prosperity, for example, environmental protections, for example, national projects of building dam to force individuals, sometimes we ask individuals to relocate to different places. In terms of apathy and in terms of interest, citizens have higher interest under the house, which means that all the premise about citizens' reflection voices reflected is better achieved under the house. For all of these reasons, we are happy to oppose.
I think the opposition whipped for that speech. Next, I'd like to call upon the leader of opposition reply. Hear, hear.
Sorry, please let me refresh first. I hope I'm audible. Am I? Maybe I am.
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. When laws can be interpreted and can be like manipulated in whatever way they want by a group of elites, we don't need laws in the first place. Because you can have a law that says that if you do something morally bad, you are punished. But a society doesn't function in that way. In fact, we create many laws specifying what things are criminal, what things are simply bad. So it's very important to acknowledge that whether the lawmaking process is just and the application of these laws are done through a just system. And therefore, we think this is important to look at the principles of the common laws and civil laws and look at which side is more just. And therefore, we win the debate. So two things to look at. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the principle. Secondly, how we make progressive laws. On both cases, we win. Firstly, we think that the principles of the criminal justice system is very important because we told you from the beginning of this debate that people should be free, but unfortunately, you're born into a framework called laws. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we have to look at on what occasions can we justify laws to limit people's rights. The first thing we told you about was about accessibility. It needs to be clearly written. It's not up to the judges. It's not up to any individual to make weird interpretations. Because we simply think that your capacity to avoid breaking laws is important for deciding whether laws are just or not. Now, to that, UPM answered that, well, you can look at the precedents and that's enough, you know. The thing is, that leads us to another problem, which is that precedents are very skewed towards harming minorities exclusively, especially the weak people, especially the blacks in the United States, and that is a real problem. Now, what they have told us is that from the whip speaker was that, well, the judges can choose which precedent to apply. The problem in the United States is that all precedents are racist and all precedents are bad, put exclusive higher punishments for the black people, and that's bad. We think that at the point you can't really choose which state you're born into, the laws must apply fairly, and that's what's not happening under a common law system where people are skewed by the racist biases that they have. The second thing was about consent. We talked about people, about how judges are unelected, they are from exclusive privileged backgrounds, and therefore they have biases. The Deputy Prime Minister says something very weird. It was like, oh, judges would say after seeing the protest of Black Lives Matter, oh, sorry, we were always racist, forgive us, we will not put any more Black people into jail. If that is true, the first thing I would say is that they aren't really defending common laws, which is stated by the info side, which says that you are judging exclusively on precedents. What the government is saying is that you are exclusively judging on the basis of empathy, and that is not what you can do in this debate. But secondly, they have told us that people have an incentive to listen to these kind of things. Why do judges have that? They don't literally no logic as to why we think and the processes, logical processes of how judges would take that in public views into account, which leads to my second point, which is about how we make progressive laws. We have told you why we think that court is a slow mover for many reasons, especially under common law, because they rest upon precedents. You look at the past precedents, you apply that to what happens then. We also told you how it is that in order for minorities to have any power within the judge echo chamber, you have to become the top of the Supreme Court, and you have to be very lucky and able. That takes like 40 years. On the other house, if you want to influence the parliament, you can make a protest, and that affects the next election that comes in 4 years. It's much more better on our side of the house. The only things like seeming logic coming from their side of the house was that, oh, judges care about criticism. We told you that they live in an echo chamber, and we citizens don't necessarily care about who the judges are. We don't necessarily think that criticism works. For all these reasons, we think this motion falls. Thank you.
I think the leader of opposition replied for that speech. Next and finally, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to reply. You're here.
I'm audible.
Yes.
Thanks so much. Okay, thank you, Chair. Let me examine two things. Firstly, whether opposition gave us sufficient mechanism on reflecting will of citizens through political discourse. Because opposition's principle about consent is very contingent on the successful practical analysis about political discourse. Here, there is a crucial failure from opposition. They just neglected many important analysis from our side, especially a preemption. We already told you how, despite of some progressive change in society, the law framework are less likely to be flexibly changed, and this is problematic. Only response from their side was, like a DLO said, we changed hundreds of law in Japan and juvenile law. It's just an example-based refutation, not supported by any logic, I guess. And also, as we pointed out, in terms of juvenile, in terms of example, it took 20 or 30 years to change. This means our argument about time-consuming extremely shining here, and we had the logic there, right? Such kind of time-consuming exists because of prioritization of discourse will exist because like coronaviruses, more economically important things might be existing in the parliament. In these circumstances, such kind of things will be less prioritized. In these circumstances, these things are not discussed, and those people's rights are not abandoned. In these circumstances, those fundamental rights of people cannot be protected for years. That's the problem we identified. And the second things they said is like people can go to vote to reflect their own opinion. Minority can do that, but the point is they haven't told us how actually minority can reflect their own vote to the political discourse. Because as I already pointed out or preempted, like noisy minority like priority will be reflected on the political discourse because privilege the individual in a political dynasty try to continue to get the benefit from such kind of individual. In these circumstances, by the connection as the bureaucrat, they want to keep such kind of law existing like gay marriage without things such kind of things. In these circumstances, it is extremely difficult for the very minority people to actually have the proper way to change the discourse. Secondly, minority already deprived the political power, as government people already pointed out, because things like gerrymandering or a very small rate of the turnout rate exists in the African American people in the United States. In these circumstances, how in the very proper processes they can actually reflect their own will to the politic is very vaguely presented on their several house. Thus, apart from their very sophisticated explanation about principle, but the practical part was not clearly explained. Therefore, their argument will not make any sense. Move on to the second part. whether government owner paradigm comparatively give them a flexible changes in the society. We say it might not be perfect, but comparatively better than opposition. We already told you many characterizations of judges and the possibility how the flexibility judgment can be done. Opposition neglected many things. Firstly, we already told you how individual can be apart from such kind of very like privileged biases. For example, even if you are white, you can be the gay white. Even if you are African American, you can sympathize with the very suffering of the minority of gay because you are regarded as a minority, suffer from such kind of nature of the minority. In these circumstances, those individuals can be brave enough to have decision to reflect will of a citizen's or social discourse. Secondly, my partner told you, like jury or those kind of people are not give up appealing to the judges because they have there is still room to persuade the judges because we can choose this precedent and we can interpret this law in this way. In these circumstances, we can like think that those rights of those individual like gay people or like outing right is very invading human rights. Those kind of things is still possible on that paradigm. In these circumstances, this is a trial from the people. In these circumstances, judges might be impressed by such the power of the people and might change the or like verdict. In these circumstances, this will be a reflecting will of the people. The best comparison in this debate is, even if we concede some individual might be racist, as opposition side said, but we can fix that error, right? Because we have a three trial system or that jury system. But in these circumstances, we can try and change and try to listen to the voices of people. But on their paradigm, because premise law itself is wrong. In these circumstances, even if we have three trial system, in this three times maybe that is the same consequences, right? In these circumstances, the reflection of people's will structurally never be done. That is crucial failure of opposition. For this reason, for the flexible justice to be carried out, we are very happy to be champion of this debate. Thank you.
Reflection.
I think the Prime Minister replied for that speech. All speech is over. I thank all speakers once again for a brilliant grand final to this competition. The results will be announced in the closing ceremony. So participants may feel free to leave the room if they feel so. May I ask that all the judges for this round come to the judge room where we'll be deliberating. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. お疲れ様です。
ありがとうございます。